His rough hands, my reckless heart. Welcome to the world of country romance. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The world had been scoured clean by the wind, leaving only a raw, bruised earth and a sky the color of a fading photograph. The wagon, a rickety skeleton of its former self, groaned under the weight of their meager existence as it crested the final rise, revealing the farm that was to be their sanctuary. Dust, a fine gritty powder the color of rust, coated everything, the tired flanks of the horse, the splintered wood of the wagon, and the three figures huddled on the driver's bench. Dolly, at 21, felt as if the dust had settled deep within her bones, a permanent grit in her soul that mirrored the one under her fingernails. Beside her, her father, James, held the reins with a grip that was less about control and more about holding on to the last vestiges of his own strength. His gaze fixed forward on the cluster of buildings that represented a new, unwelcome beginning. Between them sat Great Aunt Sue Ellen, her crystal blue eyes, so like Dolly's own, wide with a vacant wonder, a child lost in the landscape of her own fractured mind. The tornado that had torn their Kansas life to shreds had been a physical manifestation of the storms that had already ripped their family apart, leaving them as hollowed out and exposed as the plains around them. A man detached himself from the porch of the main farmhouse, a tall figure whose silhouette was defined by the broad brim of a cowboy hat. As they drew closer, Dolly could make out the details that the setting sun illuminated. Reddish light brown hair that caught the last rays of light like burnished copper, a dusting of stubble across a strong jaw, and a quiet watchfulness in his eyes. This was Leonard, the sheep farmer, their new landlord, and James's new employer. He moved with an unhurried economy of motion, approaching the wagon without a wasted step. He didn't offer effusive greetings or hollow words of pity, for which Dolly was immediately grateful. Instead, he simply reached for the horse's bridle, his large, capable hands bringing the weary animal to a halt. "You made it," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to suit the vast, quiet landscape. "James, ma'am." He nodded to each of them in turn, his gaze lingering for a moment on Dolly before shifting to the small cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwoods, a short distance away. "I've got it ready for you. There's water in the basin and wood for the stove. It's not much, but it's sound." As James climbed down, his joints protesting with a weary groan, Sue Ellen stirred, her focus latching onto the tall stranger before her. A slow, beatific smile spread across her face, smoothing the lines of confusion. "Henry, oh Henry, you came for us," she murmured, her voice thin and reedy. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the rough canvas of Leonard's sleeve. James froze, his face tightening with a familiar mix of shame and sorrow, ready to explain, to apologize. But before he could speak, Leonard simply took the old woman's hand in his own, his grip surprisingly gentle. "It's all right, Sue Ellen," he said, his voice softening. "Let's get you inside, out of the wind." He helped her down from the wagon as if it were the most natural thing in the world, his patience a silent balm on the raw nerves of the new arrivals. Dolly watched, a knot of apprehension in her chest loosening just a fraction. This man, this stranger, had met the most broken part of her family with a quiet grace she hadn't expected. A small act of kindness in a world that had become relentlessly cruel. The days that followed blurred into a routine of survival and weary adjustment. The cabin, though clean and sound as promised, felt suffocatingly small, each of them moving around the others and the ghosts they carried with them. James threw himself into the grueling work of a farmhand, mending fences and tending to the flock from sunup to sundown, returning to the cabin each night so physically exhausted he had no energy left for the grief that haunted his eyes. Dolly, meanwhile, found her days consumed by the twin tasks of domesticity and caretaking. She scrubbed and cooked and cleaned, fighting back the ever-present dust in a futile attempt to impose order on their chaotic new life. Her primary focus, however, was Sue Ellen. The disease of her mind was a shifting, unpredictable tide. Some mornings her great aunt would be lucid, her memories sharp and clear as she shared a treasured story about Dolly's mother, her voice filled with a warmth that brought tears to Dolly's eyes. But other times a fog would descend, and she would look at Dolly with the unrecognizing eyes of a stranger, or become possessed by a sudden, inexplicable urge to wander off, convinced she needed to find the home they had lost to the tornado, or even the one from her own long-vanished childhood. It was during one such spell that Leonard began to bridge the distance between them. He appeared at the cabin door one afternoon, holding a small shivering lamb. "Its mother won't take it," he explained, holding it out to Dolly. "It'll need the bottle every few hours." He showed her how to mix the milk and hold the lamb, his large hands guiding hers with a gentle precision. In the quiet intimacy of the task, they began to talk. He didn't ask her about the storm, but instead about the small things, the life they had before. Hesitantly at first, then with a rush of pent-up sorrow, she told him about the younger brother she had lost to a river when they were children, and about the way her mother had slowly faded afterward, succumbing to a grief so profound it had ultimately stolen her from them as well. He listened without interruption, his gaze steady and compassionate, and in his quiet presence she felt the crushing weight on her chest lighten, if only for a moment. He, in turn, spoke little of himself, but she saw the loneliness in the stark tidiness of his own home and in the way he watched her family, as if observing a species he had long forgotten. A few days later, she watched from the kitchen window as Sue Ellen, in a fit of helpfulness, followed Leonard as he was mending a fence, solemnly handing him rocks instead of fence staples. To Dolly's astonishment, Leonard didn't correct her. He simply accepted each rock with a quiet "thank you" and set it carefully aside, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. As the sun bled across the horizon that evening, casting long shadows that stretched from the corral, Dolly watched him move among his sheep, a solitary figure in a vast landscape. For the first time since the world had been torn apart, she felt a fragile, unfamiliar seed of hope begin to take root in the desolate soil of her heart. The harshness of their arrival began to soften with the turning of the seasons, the relentless prairie winds gradually carrying away the initial bitterness of their displacement and replacing it with the fragile dust of routine. As the sun-baked earth gave way to the cooler mornings of late summer, the distance between Dolly and Leonard closed with the slow, inevitable certainty of a river finding its course to the sea. He seemed to find a quiet purpose in drawing her out of the shadows of her grief and the confines of the cabin, first introducing her to a gentle, steady-eyed mare named Clover. He taught her not just to ride, but to understand the animal, to feel the subtle shift of muscle beneath her, to trust the silent communication that passed through the reins. On these rides, the vast empty landscape that had once felt so intimidating began to reveal its secrets to her under his tutelage. He led her through whispering aspen groves where the sunlight fell in dappled coins on the forest floor, and along the banks of a winding creek where the water ran so clear you could count the polished stones on its bed. He showed her which plants could be used for seasoning and which berries were sweet enough to eat straight from the vine, his knowledge of the land as intimate and profound as if the plains themselves spoke to him. In return, Dolly brought a life and warmth to his solitary existence that he had clearly been starved for, her presence filling the quiet corners of his world. She would insist he join them for supper, filling the small cabin with the rich smells of stews and freshly baked bread, and the even richer sound of laughter, a sound so foreign to that space that it initially seemed to startle the very timbers of the walls. She took to mending his work clothes, her needle and thread, moving with a practiced skill that spoke of a lifetime of making do, and he would watch her, a look of quiet wonder on his face as she stitched a patch onto his sleeve, transforming a simple act of repair into an act of care. The spark of attraction that had flickered between them during those first few days now grew into a slow-burning fire, a palpable heat that existed in the lingering glances across the dinner table, the accidental brush of their hands as he passed her a pail of water, and the shared silence as they watched the sun set the sky ablaze, painting the world in colors of fire and gold. This burgeoning peace, however, was as delicate as a spider's web, and it wasn't long before the first unsettling tremors threatened to tear it asunder. The disturbances began as small, almost dismissible things, easily explained away by chance or the natural hardships of farm life. A length of fence on the far western boundary of the property was discovered to be cut, the wire snipped with a clean, deliberate precision that belied the work of a wandering animal or simple wear. Leonard repaired it without much comment, his jaw tight as he worked, but a new watchfulness entered his eyes. A week later, a handful of ewes vanished from a northern pasture, leaving behind no trace of their struggle, no blood, and no tracks of a wolf or coyote, which was the most unnerving part of all. It was as if the sheep had simply dissolved into the tall prairie grass, swallowed by the immense, silent land. Leonard spent a full day riding the perimeter, his expression growing more strained with each passing hour, returning only after dusk, with a grim set to his mouth. He tried to reassure James that it was likely the work of opportunistic rustlers who were just passing through, a common enough plague in these parts. But from that day forward, his rifle, which had previously leaned against the wall inside his door, became a constant companion, resting in the scabbard of his saddle or held in the crook of his arm. The incidents, though small, cast a long shadow, a subtle but persistent hum of anxiety that settled over the farm, reminding Dolly that their newfound sanctuary was perhaps more fragile than she had allowed herself to believe. The true nature of the tension that clung to Leonard became starkly clear during a necessary trip into the nearby town of Redemption for supplies. The town was little more than a single dusty street flanked by weathered false front buildings, a place that seemed to have been baked into a permanent state of weary resignation by the relentless sun. As Leonard guided the wagon to a halt in front of the general store, Dolly noticed the way the few people on the boardwalk paused to watch them, their gazes lingering on Leonard with an unreadable mixture of deference and caution. Inside the store, the air grew thick with a strained silence when they entered. The proprietor was polite enough, but it was the encounter that happened as they were leaving that etched itself into Dolly's memory. A broad, imposing man with a hard face and eyes as cold and gray as river stones blocked their path on the boardwalk. He was dressed in clothes that were a little too fine for a simple rancher, and he looked at Leonard with an air of undisguised contempt. "Well, Leonard," the man sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear, "still trying to make a living off those pathetic sheep. I'm surprised a strong wind hasn't blown your whole flock, and you with it, clear to Mexico." The insult was delivered with a cruel smile, and Dolly felt a flare of anger on Leonard's behalf. She saw a dangerous light flash deep in Leonard's eyes, a muscle feathering in his cheek, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously calm. "My flock is my business, Silas," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "Just like your own affairs are yours, I'd suggest you keep it that way." The man, Silas Blackwood, let out a short, ugly laugh before stepping aside, but his eyes followed them all the way to their wagon. The ride home was cloaked in a heavy, brooding silence. Leonard's hands were clenched on the reins, his focus lost somewhere on the distant horizon. Dolly wanted to ask to understand the source of the raw animosity she had just witnessed, but the impenetrable wall he had erected around himself was too high for her to scale, and she knew that whatever demons he was fighting, he would have to face them alone. The unspoken anxieties that hovered over the farm coalesced into pure, heart-stopping terror a few weeks later. It was a warm afternoon, and Dolly had become absorbed in the rhythmic work of kneading bread dough on the cabin's small wooden table, the familiar motions a comforting anchor in her often unpredictable days. It was only when she looked up, her hands coated in flour, that she realized the cabin was too quiet. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, washed over her as she saw the front door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. "Aunt Sue Ellen?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. A frantic search of the small cabin and the immediate yard confirmed her fears. Sue Ellen was gone. Blind panic seized Dolly, stealing her breath and turning the blood in her veins to ice. She ran out into the fields, screaming her great-aunt's name, her calls sounding thin and desperate against the vast emptiness of the prairie. James, hearing the terror in his daughter's voice, came running from the barn, his face a mask of fear. Together they began a desperate, disorganized search, their movements growing more frantic as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, menacing shadows across the land. It was Leonard, drawn by their shouts, who brought a sense of order to their chaos. He arrived on Clover at a full gallop, his face grim but his demeanor calm and focused. After a few quick questions, he dismounted, his eyes scanning the ground with an intensity that missed nothing. He was the one who found the faint, shuffling tracks leading away from the cabin toward the creek that snaked through the property. "She follows the water sometimes," he said, his voice a steady reassurance in the swirl of Dolly's fear. "She told me once it reminds her of a place she knew as a girl." He sent James to check the length of the creek upstream, while he and Dolly headed downstream, his methodical approach a stark contrast to her own frantic terror. He found her less than a mile away, sitting on a sun-warmed rock at the water's edge, calmly dipping her bare feet into the cool, clear stream, a small, contented smile on her face. She had no memory of how she had gotten there, and looked up at them with a mild, pleasant surprise, as if they had simply stumbled upon her during a leisurely stroll. The relief that flooded Dolly was so profound it left her weak and trembling, and she could only stand there, tears streaming down her face, as Leonard gently helped the exhausted old woman to her feet. He lifted Sue Ellen into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all, and carried her all the way back to the cabin, his long, steady strides eating up the ground. The incident shook Dolly to her very core, a brutal reminder of the fragility of her aunt's mind and the constant vigilance her care required. But as she walked beside Leonard, watching the tender way he carried her great aunt, his quiet strength a shield against the world, the admiration and gratitude she felt for him deepened and bloomed into something far more powerful, a feeling of safety and belonging that she hadn't realized she had been so desperately missing. That evening, a profound quiet settled over the farm, the earlier panic having drained the energy from all of them. After James and Sue Ellen had retired for the night, Dolly found Leonard by the corral, leaning against the top rail and staring out into the moon-drenched darkness. She walked over and stood beside him, the silence between them comfortable and freighted with unspoken emotion. The air was cool and smelled of hay and dust and the faint, clean scent of the coming autumns. The emotional charge that had been building between them for weeks now seemed to crackle in the space between them, a tangible force that drew them inexorably closer. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes dark and serious in the pale moonlight. "I'm glad you're here, Dolly," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "All of you." He raised his hand, his movement slow and deliberate, and gently brushed a stray strand of dusty blonde hair from her face, his calloused thumb stroking her cheek with a tenderness that made her heart ache. The rough texture of his skin sent a shiver through her entire body. He leaned in closer, his gaze dropping to her lips, and she knew with a dizzying certainty that he was going to kiss her. Her own lips parted in anticipation, her breath catching in her throat. The world seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of them, the corral, and the vast starry sky above. Just as his lips were about to meet hers, the cabin door creaked open, and James's voice cut through the spellbound night. "Dolly, everything all right out here?" The moment shattered, splintering into 1,000 pieces of lost potential. Leonard pulled back as if he'd been burned, putting a respectable distance between them. The warmth of his touch instantly gone. "Everything's fine, Pa," she called back, her voice sounding steadier than she felt. The promise of the kiss, however, remained, hanging in the cool night air like a ghost, a silent vow of what was yet to come. The fragile peace that had settled over the farm was destined to be short-lived, for the prairie was a place of violent extremes, and its temper, like that of some men, could turn in an instant. The change began subtly, with a strange greenish-yellow tint to the afternoon sky, and an oppressive stillness in the air that caused the sheep to huddle together nervously, their usual placid grazing forgotten. An ominous silence fell over the land, a heavy blanket that smothered every normal sound, leaving only the frantic buzzing of insects and the distant mournful cry of a lone hawk circling high above. Dolly felt a primal unease prickle at the back of her neck, a deep-seated instinct passed down from generations of plains dwellers who knew to fear a sky that looked bruised and unwell. The first sign of the storm's true fury came not as rain, but as a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate up from the very bedrock of the earth, a monstrous growl from the horizon that steadily grew in volume and intensity. Then the wind arrived, a sudden violent exhalation that tore through the cottonwood trees, ripping leaves from their branches and sending a tidal wave of dust and debris scouring across the yard. The sky, which had been merely sullen, now turned to a roiling cauldron of black and purple clouds that churned with a terrifying, malevolent energy. Within minutes, the world outside the small cabin was plunged into a premature twilight, a disorienting gloom pierced only by jagged, incandescent flashes of lightning that ripped the heavens apart, each one followed by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the cabin to its foundations. It was in the chaotic moments after one particularly violent clap of thunder, as she was rushing to secure the rattling window shutter, that a cold, sickening dread washed over Dolly. She realized with a jolt of pure terror that Sue Ellen, who had been quietly humming to herself in the rocking chair by the hearth just moments before, was no longer there. A frantic glance around the small room confirmed her absence, and her eyes fell upon the cabin door, which was swinging wildly on its hinges, its latch unsecured and banging against the frame in a frantic rhythm that mimicked the frantic beating of her own heart. A cry of pure, unadulterated terror was torn from Dolly's throat as she plunged out into the maelstrom, heedless of her own safety. The wind hit her with the force of a physical blow, stealing her breath and plastering her dress to her body, while the rain, which had begun to fall in thick, slanting sheets, stung her skin like 1,000 tiny needles. "Aunt Sue Ellen!" she screamed, her voice a thin, reedy thing that was instantly swallowed by the roaring gale. The world had transformed into a terrifying, primordial soup of wind, water, and darkness, a place where landmarks were erased, and the very concept of direction seemed to have dissolved. James burst from the barn, his face a pale mask of alarm, having heard her cry over the din of the storm. He grabbed her arm to steady her, his own fear a palpable thing, and together they began to stumble through the deluge, their calls to her aunt lost in the overwhelming symphony of the storm's fury. Panic began to set in, a cold, paralyzing serpent coiling in Dolly's stomach. Her great aunt was out here somewhere, frail and confused, lost in a storm that would be terrifying to even the strongest and most clear-headed of individuals. It was Leonard who brought a desperately needed sliver of coherence to their frantic, panicked search. He appeared as if from nowhere, a solid, reassuring presence emerging from the gray curtain of rain, his horse, Clover, standing steadfastly beside him. He didn't waste time on questions or recriminations. He simply took charge, his voice cutting through the chaos with an authority that commanded their attention. His deep knowledge of the land, which had once been a source of simple fascination for Dolly, now became their only real hope. He knew every dip and hollow, every grove of trees, every rock outcropping that might offer some meager shelter from the storm's relentless assault. "James, check the main barn and the shearing shed again. Look in every corner," he yelled over the wind. "Dolly, come with me. If she wandered, she might have followed the old fence line toward the cottonwoods. There's a slight rise there. She might have tried to get to higher ground." He helped Dolly onto Clover's back, swinging up behind her and wrapping a steadying arm around her waist before urging the brave mare into the teeth of the gale. They rode into a world of violent confusion where the rain was so thick it was like moving through water, and the only light came from the terrifying, strobe-like flashes of lightning that illuminated a landscape made alien and monstrous by the storm. Dolly huddled against Leonard's solid form, drawing strength from his unwavering calm, her fear for her aunt a burning knot in her chest. He navigated through the chaos with an instinct that was almost supernatural, guiding the horse around unseen obstacles and through sheets of rain that reduced visibility to mere feet. He was right. Near the far property line, the one that bordered the lands of Silas Blackwood, they found a set of faint, shuffling footprints being rapidly obliterated by the downpour, leading toward a dilapidated, long-forgotten structure half hidden in a thicket of overgrown brush. It was an old line shack, its roof sagging and its walls listing, a relic from a time long past that Dolly had never even known existed. A weak, flickering light emanated from a grimy window, and with a surge of hope so powerful it almost buckled her knees, Dolly slid from the horse and stumbled toward the door. Inside they found her. Sue Ellen was huddled in a corner, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, her eyes wide with fear, but her body blessedly unharmed and dry. She was shivering and disoriented, but she was safe. As Leonard moved to comfort the old woman, speaking to her in a low, soothing voice, the beam from the lantern he carried swept across the small one-room interior, and what it revealed made the blood in Dolly's veins run cold, instantly replacing her relief with a chilling new sense of dread. In the far corner of the shack stood a small, crudely constructed pen, and inside that pen, bleating softly, was a lamb. Dolly recognized the distinct black markings on its face immediately. It was one of the lambs that had vanished from Leonard's flock weeks ago. Strewn about the floor were other signs of a secret occupant: a dirty bedroll, several recently emptied tins of beans, and a half-eaten loaf of bread. The cut fences, the missing sheep, it wasn't the work of transient rustlers. Someone had been living here right under their noses, methodically stealing from Leonard, using his own land as a base from which to slowly bleed him dry. As this horrifying realization dawned on them, a large figure filled the shack's narrow doorway, blocking their only exit and casting a long, menacing shadow into the room. It was Silas Blackwood, his face a thunderous mask of rage and surprise, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He had clearly not expected to find his secret hideout occupied, and his eyes, cold and hard as granite, flickered from the terrified Sue Ellen to the lamb in the pen, and finally to Leonard, his expression curdling into one of pure venomous hatred. He tried to recover quickly, forcing a sneer onto his face as he attempted to bluff his way out of the situation. "Well, well, Leonard, out for a ride in this lovely weather?" he drawled, his voice thick with false bravado. "Just checking my fence line and thought I'd get out of the rain. Now I suggest you take this crazy old woman and get off my property before you get hurt." But the lie was too thin, his guilt too palpable. Leonard didn't rise to the bait, nor did he reach for the pistol holstered at his hip. Instead, he remained utterly, unnervingly still, his calm a stark and powerful contrast to Blackwood's blustering aggression. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, yet it carried an unmistakable weight of cold, hard certainty that cut through the noise of the storm. "Your property, Silas. That's interesting because this shack has been on my family's land for 50 years, he stated, his eyes never leaving Blackwood's. "Just like these boot prints of yours are going to match the ones I found next to my cut fences. And I imagine Sheriff Miller will be very interested to know that you've been systematically trying to sabotage my farm, stealing my livestock, all so you could drive me out and make a cheap offer on the land. It's the water rights you want, isn't it, Silas? You always were greedy." Every word was a carefully placed stone, building a wall of irrefutable truth that left Blackwood cornered and exposed. Seeing that he was trapped, A desperate feral glint entered Blackwood's eyes, and his hand twitched, moving instinctively toward the handle of his own gun. But before he could make his move, another figure emerged from the storm-racked darkness behind him. It was James, his face grim and determined, holding his old hunting rifle with a steadiness that belied the tremor in his hands. "I think you've said enough, Blackwood," James said, his voice low and firm. "It's time for you to leave." Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and utterly exposed, the rage on Silas Blackwood's face dissolved into a look of pure, impotent fury. He spat a curse onto the dirt floor, shot one last look of pure hatred at Leonard, and then turned and vanished back into the raging storm, swallowed by the very darkness he had sought to use for his own corrupt ends. In the sudden ringing silence that followed his departure, surrounded by the cacophony of the storm outside, Leonard moved to Dolly's side. He wrapped a strong protective arm around her shoulders, pulling both her and her trembling great-aunt into his embrace. The world outside was still a vortex of chaos and violence, but within the circle of his arm, inside the walls of that dilapidated shack, Dolly felt an overwhelming sense of safety and finality. She looked up at him, her heart overflowing with a feeling that went far beyond simple affection or gratitude. It was a profound, unshakable trust, a deep-seated admiration for the intelligent, honorable man who had not only saved her family, but had faced down a storm of human wickedness without losing his own quiet strength. The storm, having spent its fury, retreated as morning dawned, leaving behind a world that felt scoured and newly washed, the air crisp and clean, with the scent of damp earth and rain-soaked sage. The violent chaos of the previous night seemed like a fever dream in the calm, quiet light of day. But the grim reality of their discovery in the line shack remained, a hard, undeniable truth that demanded a reckoning. There was no discussion or debate. A quiet, resolute understanding passed between Leonard and James over a mug of hot coffee as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Accompanied by Dolly's father, whose presence offered a silent, steadfast pillar of support, Leonard rode into the town of redemption, his posture straight and his purpose clear. They went directly to the small clapboard building that served as the sheriff's office, where a balding, weary-looking man named Sheriff Miller looked up from his paperwork with an expression of mild surprise. In the past, Miller had often treated Leonard with a kind of dismissive patience, swayed, like many in the town, by the subtle influence and perceived importance of a wealthy landowner like Silas Blackwood. Today, however, there was a different quality to Leonard's demeanor, a gravity and unshakable certainty that commanded the sheriff's full and undivided attention. Leonard didn't raise his voice or make accusations fueled by anger. Instead, he laid out the facts with a calm, methodical precision that was far more damning than any emotional outburst could have been. He described the location of the shack, producing the official county map from his saddlebag that clearly showed the structure fell well within the boundaries of his deeded land. He told the sheriff about the stolen lamb they had found penned inside, offering it as irrefutable physical evidence of Blackwood's thievery. And then James, in his own quiet but firm voice, gave his account of the events, describing how he had witnessed Blackwood in the shack, effectively trapped by his own guilt, and his angry words amounting to a confession. Leonard connected these recent events to the months of quiet sabotage, the cut fences, the mysteriously vanished sheep, the constant low-level pressure designed to demoralize him and drive down the value of his farm. Faced with a credible witness, physical evidence, and a logical, well-articulated account of a criminal conspiracy, Sheriff Miller could no longer hide behind indifference or favoritism. The gears of the law, slow and rusty as they may have been, finally began to turn against Silas Blackwood. The ensuing investigation was swift and conclusive. Blackwood's blustering denials crumbled under the weight of the evidence, and when confronted with James's unwavering testimony, his arrogance finally shattered. The public humiliation of being legally compelled to pay Leonard full market value for every sheep he had stolen was a far greater punishment than a jail cell would have been, for it struck at the very core of his identity, his wealth and his pride. His power in the community, built on a foundation of intimidation and ill-gotten influence, evaporated like a puddle in the summer sun, leaving him exposed as nothing more than a common thief, a petty tyrant brought low not by violence, but by the quiet, unyielding integrity of the very man he had sought to destroy. In the weeks and months that followed, a profound and lasting peace settled over the farm, a tranquility that was more than just the absence of a threat. It was a tangible presence, something that could be felt in the gentle rustle of the tall grass and seen in the clear, untroubled expanse of the vast prairie sky. With the dark cloud of Silas Blackwood's menace finally dissipated, the social climate of the surrounding area began to change as well. The very same neighbors who had once regarded Leonard with suspicion and kept a careful, deliberate distance now began to approach, their attitudes transformed by the public revelation of his honor and Blackwood's deceit. The change manifested itself in small, yet deeply significant, acts of community. A rancher from the neighboring property, a man who had previously only ever offered a curt nod, stopped by one afternoon with two of his sons to help Leonard raise a heavy beam for a new shed he was building. The general store owner's wife made a special point of giving Dolly a jar of her prize-winning peach preserves, telling her it was a welcome gift for the newest members of their town. These simple gestures were threads of acceptance, weaving Leonard, Dolly, and her family into the social fabric of the place they now called home. Life on the farm fell into a comfortable, healing rhythm. The work was still hard, the days still long, but they were no longer tinged with the bitter edge of anxiety. Even Sue Ellen seemed to benefit from the newfound serenity. While the fog in her mind still came and went with its own unpredictable tide, her moments of lucidity grew more frequent, and her periods of anxious wandering lessened. There were long, peaceful afternoons where she would sit contentedly on the cabin porch, a placid smile on her face as she watched the lambs frolicking in the pasture, her presence no longer a source of constant, heart-stopping worry, but rather a gentle, sweet reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the simple, quiet joys that could still be found in a world that had once seemed so full of sorrow. One cool evening, as the setting sun was beginning to paint the clouds in brilliant strokes of orange and violet, James sought out Leonard, finding him leaning against the corral fence, his gaze fixed on the flock as they settled for the night. The two men stood in a comfortable silence for a long while, watching the day come to a close. Finally, James cleared his throat and spoke, his voice low and imbued with a deep, heartfelt emotion. "I never properly thanked you," he began, not looking at Leonard, but at the horizon. "Not just for what you did with Blackwood, for everything, for giving us a place to land when we had nothing, for the kindness you've shown my family, shown Sue Ellen." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I look at Dolly," he continued, his voice growing thick with feeling, "and I see a light in her eyes that I thought was gone forever. I thought it was extinguished when we lost her brother, and I knew it was gone when her mother followed him. For years, she's just been surviving, holding us all together. But here, with you, she's starting to live again." He finally turned to look at Leonard, his gaze direct and filled with a father's profound gratitude. A man's worth isn't measured by the acres he owns or the money he has in the bank. It's measured by the shelter he can build against the storms of this world. You, Leonard, are a good man. You've built a shelter for my family, and for that, I will forever be in your debt. It was not just an expression of thanks. It was a blessing, a solemn and sacred passing of trust from a father to the man he now knew was worthy of his daughter's heart. A few weeks later, when the memory of the storm had faded and the new peace felt as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet, Leonard asked Dolly to take a walk with him. He didn't say where they were going, but she followed without hesitation, her hand resting comfortably in his. He led her away from the farm buildings, up the gentle slope of the high ridge that overlooked the entire valley, the same ridge they had crested on that first desperate day of their arrival. The view was breathtaking. The setting sun had set the entire sky on fire, and the warm golden light bathed the landscape in a soft, ethereal glow. Their small farmhouse, the sturdy barn, and the distant, contented flock of sheep all seemed to nestle into the land as if they had been there forever. They stood for a long time, simply absorbing the beauty and the silence, before Leonard finally turned to her, his face serious, and his eyes full of an emotion so deep it made her own heart ache in response. He didn't have a trove of pretty words or polished phrases. His speech was as honest and unadorned as the man himself. "Dolly," he began, his voice rough with feeling, "before you came here, this was just land. The house was just a place to sleep, and the days were just something to get through. I was as lost as you were, just in a different kind of storm. You and your family, you filled up the silence. You took this empty place and you made it a home." He took both of her hands in his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "You taught me how to live again, not just how to survive." Then, to her complete and utter astonishment, this strong, quiet man dropped to one knee in the tall prairie grass. He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a diamond, not a ring of gold or silver, but a simple, delicate ring he had carved from the pale, smooth wood of a cottonwood tree, the same kind that sheltered their cabin. "I'm not a man who has much to offer in the way of worldly goods," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I can offer you my whole heart, my strength, and all of my days. Dolly, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me right here?" Tears of pure, unadulterated joy streamed down Dolly's face, washing away the last of the dust and sorrow from her soul. Her yes was a sob and a laugh all at once, a sound of absolute certainty. He slid the wooden ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, before rising to his feet and pulling her into a deep, powerful kiss. It was a kiss that held the memory of shared hardship and the promise of a shared future, a kiss that sealed their love under the vast painted sky. And as the last sliver of the sun disappeared below the horizon, it left the two of them silhouetted against the deepening twilight, two solitary figures no longer adrift, but anchored firmly together, having finally found their homestead in the landscape of each other's hearts.